Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Ponte, and I'm the Director of Events and Programs for the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. On behalf of the entire team here, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the opening webinar of a new two-part series under the theme of From Evidence to Practice, Policies and Strategies to Advance Maine's Economy, in partnership with Science is Us. Today's webinar will be on building climate resiliency in Maine, and will highlight key points of the Maine Climate Action Plan and how they can interact with other strategies to build climate resiliency in the state while advancing our economy. Thank you so much for joining. Before we get going, there are just a few things we'd like to share with you about today's session. This meeting is being recorded, and we will make the recording available to you on our website in the next few days. If not presenting, please turn off video. To reduce background noise, all participants will stay in listen-only mode. Please stay on mute to reduce noise. We will use the chat function to share useful links and other materials. And if you lose connection, please use the same Zoom link to reconnect. And finally, please submit questions into the chat panel addressed to everyone. Time permitting, we will answer them by the end of the session. We would now like to begin by thanking our sponsors. Our presenting sponsor this morning is Science is Us. Our 2024 webinar series sponsors are AARP, Central Maine Power, Northeast Delta Dental, Kennebec Savings Bank, and Sun Life Insurance. And our supporting sponsors are Clink and WEX. Again, many thanks to all of our sponsors this morning for making this happen. It is now my pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, Patrick Woodcock. Patrick will be moderating the conversation today. Good morning, Patrick.
Well, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to continue what has been a partnership with Science is Us in a discussion about the changing climate and its impacts on Maine's economy and our environment. It's a timely discussion today. We have an incredible group of speakers, but we've also had some recent news in Maine, both for the focusing events of the December storms, legislative action in dedicating resources to invest in the infrastructure to address the risk to our infrastructure, and also with a recent report released this week by the Maine Climate Council that highlights the current risks to our infrastructure. I will say for me, the changing climate has accelerated at a level that I would never have projected when I first began my career. And at the same time, the technology to mitigate those has also become much more prevalent at a much more cost-effective level. However, I was never prepared to really see Maine go through what was visually displayed in December. For me, it was witnessing a childhood wharf that I'd grown up with that was destroyed in the December storms, and also the Chamber of Commerce staff visited Lewiston when the Androscoggin River was just cresting and lapping the bridges connecting Auburn. It's hard to be prepared, even though I've been working on climate my whole career, of seeing the visuals that we experienced in Maine. As we'll hear, climate change impacts states, regions very differently. And I couldn't be more pleased to partner with a national organization, Science is Us, to talk about its relevance, the science of climate here in the state of Maine. And with that, I will introduce who has been a partner in this with Science is Us, Rachel Carestis, who has been a partner in developing this webinar series. Rachel.
Thank you, Patrick, for your partnership and for the opportunity to engage in this very important and timely conversation, as you note today. My name is Rachel Karestis. I'm the Executive Director of Science is Us. And as Patrick said, Science is Us represents national groups of science and engineering organizations, largely scientific societies, groups that represent pretty much every discipline of science, from social science to natural and physical sciences and in engineering disciplines. And we began our partnership with the Chamber in Maine a number of years ago, actually really talking about ways that STEM broadly could help the state solve whatever challenges it was facing. And so we began actually first by talking about STEM education, and then we've moved on into topics related to the economy, and then more specifically into climate. And one of the things that Science is Us focuses on is just the depth and breadth of STEM professionals across the country, but on a state level. And that's very true in Maine. Just over 34% of Maine's workforce is STEM professionals, and STEM contributes almost $30 billion to Maine's economy. And that rate at which STEM is contributing to Maine's economy is growing at a rate that's higher than the national average, which means there's a lot of talent in the state. There's a lot of great thinking. There's a lot of great research. So there's a lot of opportunity for science and engineering to help solve some of these challenges. And one of the things that's been really unique about the research that Science is Us has done over the years is that we've looked at STEM professionals holistically. Regardless of what discipline of STEM you're working in, and regardless of what your level of education is. And in Maine, almost 57% of the state STEM professionals don't have a bachelor's degree. And that represents tremendous opportunities in terms of training professionals, staffing jobs, filling really important roles. And so as the conversation moves forward today on those ways that we can help make Maine more resilient in the face of climate change, keep in mind those STEM professionals and all of the ways in which they can contribute to that solution, not just for the state, but for the economy as a whole. So with that, I'm looking forward to the conversation. We've got a great panel, and I'll turn it back over to Patrick so that he can introduce our panelists today.
Thank you again, Rachel. Maine has been a longstanding leader in climate research. However, the last 6 months, I think, has accelerated the legislature and our leaders to do more. And really, we have panelists today who have been at the forefront of that work over the last 6 months and beyond. I do want to first say that we have Professor Ivan Fernandez with the University of Maine, who was one of the co-editors of the recent report, The Scientific Assessment of Climate Change and Its Effects in Maine, which was released earlier this week. We also have Brian Ambrett, who is the Senior Climate Resilience Coordinator with the Maine Governor's Office of Policy Innovation and the Future. Linda Nelson, who is the Economic and Community Development Director of the town of Stonington, and who will be the co-chair of Maine's Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission, which was formed by the governor last month. And then finally, Joyce Taylor, who is the chief engineer of the Maine Department of Transportation. I will turn to Professor Fernandez, who I have watched his career, is a long-term leader in climate research, both in Maine, also on the US EPA's Science Advisory Board committees in Washington, D.C. Ivan, I turn to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Rachel, for the opportunity to be here this afternoon, be part of this panel with my distinguished fellow panelists. I'm here today in the capacity as one of the three co-chairs of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council. The other co-chairs are Susie Arnold with the Island Institute and Steve Dixon with the Maine Geologic Survey. And as Patrick mentioned, this past week we released an update science assessment to support the work of the Maine Climate Council and its working groups, and you'll hear more about that from Brian in a few minutes. I'll dig right in. My charge here, or my goal here, is just to touch on some of the findings of that report. And probably everyone's familiar with the flavor of what those kind of data look like in the world of climate science. This little figure on the introductory slide is meant to sort of set the stage. Why do we care what the science says? Well, it's the science that we hopefully use to inform our decision making and our policy. It's a combination of the degree of stressors that we are experiencing, the intensity of the changing climate, which is on the severity axis, versus our own vulnerability and exposure. And we have significant opportunities to reduce the severity of the risk, as well as the increase our resilience to those exposures, and therefore keep us out of the high risk and lower risk arenas. And in a broad way, that's the risk paradigm. In this case, we're talking about it as the climate risk paradigm, which is the nature of the conversation we're having today. I'm also going to look like I'm nervous with my pen, but whoop, back up one. But that's my virtual clicker here this afternoon. So how do we know what climate science tells us? We know about climate change from the that we see in the news, particularly national news from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that's at the global scale. The U.S. Global Change Research Program gives us a national climate assessment at the national scale, but a vast majority of the kind of thinking and policy making that we do is really about what's happening in our backyard, and therefore it's so important to look at what the science tells us here in Maine. And that's the charge of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee. Yep, go ahead. In 2020, we produced a report that you see on the left here, which was the science assessment that supported the development of the original Maine Won't Wait, which also was released later that year. In 2021, we had a very short and very targeted report that was an update to components of that. But this past week, what we released is the report that you see on the right, and the URLs to download them and view the webinars about them are at the bottom of this slide. And that report is a pretty extensive 268-page update that doesn't repeat all of what we knew in 2020, but builds on that. The goal there is to provide the very latest understanding of the science, which is rapidly changing, in order to inform the kind of work that we're doing here in Maine and with the Climate Council. So what do we know about climate change impacts now that we're experiencing and in the future? To no one's surprise, it's getting warmer. And so Maine has warmed about 3.5 degrees over the last 125 years. In Maine, the 10 warmest years have occurred since 1998. On the planet, the 10 warmest years are the last 10 years. And warming will continue, somewhere between 2 and 10 degrees warming by 2100, depending on the emissions scenario that we follow. And so far, we're following a moderate to upper moderate level of emissions, but concentrations in the atmosphere are continuing to increase. Precipitation has increased about 6 inches in the same time period. We're getting more heavy precipitation events that we're all painfully aware of, particularly greater than 2-inch and 3-inch rain events based on the Maine data. And we project that trend will continue as well. Next. Probably what we feel the most impact from are the extremes, and we are seeing greater extreme in our weather system, and in some cases more frequently, in other cases not, depending on the parameter. We need to look no further back than the last couple of years. 2020 was a record-breaking dry spell that created a drought disaster declaration for the state of Maine, and then 2020, and then 2023 a year ago now, we were experiencing one of the wettest Junes on record that led to significant consequences in flooding and erosion and in infrastructure. And it's these kinds of extremes that are increasing. That's okay. Go ahead. These kinds of extremes that are increasing that are particularly challenging in order to figure out where do we invest? What kind of preparation do we do when it is so too often unpredictable with the characteristics of those extremes? We know that, stay on this slide, warming is projected to increase storm intensities. We talk about it in the sciences as the intensification of the hydrologic cycle, meaning the dry is drier and the wet is wetter. For every degree of warming of the atmosphere holds 4% more water vapor, more moisture, which is driving both the energy and the hydrology, the intensity of these storms. And most climate models project an overall decrease in extratropical cyclones, meaning above the equatorial zone on the East Coast, but increasing intensity. And yet the science remains very developmental in the prediction of frequency of these events. And we all lived here in Maine through the last winter with storms in December and January that were remarkable. And any one of those will take years to recover from. And we had a cascade of one after another. And of course, this week we're experiencing another extreme event. And you'll hear more about that from Linda and others. Next slide, please. Sea level is rising, and in the state of Maine, I don't have to underscore how critical and important that is, given the length of our coastlines, including our islands. Over the last century, we've seen about 0.6 of a foot of sea level rise. In the last 25 years or so, that rate of sea level rise has increased, and this is one of the themes of the climate indicators, is that in general, they are increasing or in cases like Arctic sea ice, decreasing. And the rate of change is accelerating by about 2.5 times over the last 25 years for sea level rise. Next slide, please. Part of the charge of the Science and Technical Subcommittee is to come up with very specific projections relative to sea level rise. We did in 2020, and we did again this year in 2024. There's two categories of sea level rise projections that we report out on. One we call a commit to manage, and the commit to manage is a projected sea level rise that has a very high likelihood of occurring. There's an envelope of variability around those projections, but our commit to manage sea level rise scenario is for 1.5 feet additional sea level rise by 2050 and 4 feet by 2100, which is exactly the same as our projection was in 2020. So there's no change in the commit to manage. The prepare to manage is basically there's a lower probability but a higher impact if those scenarios play out. And those two are roughly the same. They're about twice as much sea level rise as these, but they're expected to be on the prepare to manage side about 2 decades or 20 years delayed in that trajectory. One other or two other points to make on this slide is, number one, Pete Slavinsky with the Maine Geologic Survey, who put this together, put a note on there that in 2023, 2024, we're currently trending well above any of these scenarios, and certainly the interannual variability is high, and so the uncertainty is an important part of all of our projections. And the second is that this projection goes out to 2150, because by 2100, which we often hear in climate projections, we know sea level will continue to rise and very likely will be outpacing our ability to adapt. And so planning for a longer time horizon is increasingly important. Next slide, please. Nuisance flooding or sunny day flooding has increased. Historical record is about 4 per year. Short-term means in the last 20 years is about 10 per year, and yet in 2024 we're already at 18 and counting. And so we expect that the frequency of this kind of flooding will increase. Next slide, please. And sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Maine are warming, as probably most know, faster than 97% of the world's ocean, 3 times faster than it used to be. And this projection is to continue along these trajectories, which are having profound impacts on the physics of the ocean, but particularly the fisheries. Next slide. So closing thoughts, I think I'm out of time. Most indicators of climate change are accelerating. Science-informed climate solutions are also accelerating, but not enough. Science-informed climate solutions are cost-effective, and I didn't have time to get into that today, but we find time and time again that, yes, often the upfront costs are what we see the most of, but the actual benefit cost analysis tells us that they're extremely cost effective to get ahead of the consequences. Maine won't wait, you'll hear about, but that's a critical framework for us to move forward, and business as usual is not an option. So with that, thank you.
Well, thank you, Ivan. That's an incredible amount of information to provide in a fast-moving, unfolding climate science. Thank you for that overview. Going to turn now to Brian Ambrett, who I introduced earlier, who is going to be discussing some of the work with the Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, as well as the Climate Council. Brian.
Great. Thanks very much, Patrick. And while the slides are coming up, I'm having a bit of a thunderstorm here in Portland today. So if I drop off, it's because the power's gone out, the internet's dropped, but hopefully it doesn't happen. So as Patrick said, my name is Brian Ambrett. I'm the Climate Resilience Coordinator in the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future. And climate change has been a priority for Governor Mills since the early day of her administration 5 years ago. And my office, which we call GOPIF, leads the work on her priority policy areas, which includes climate and the Maine Climate Council. And as Patrick and Ivan have said, the storms of December and January, really the storms of the past 18 months, we've had 8 federal disaster declarations now in the last 18 months, which is really far out of the range of what's normal for Maine. And this has really brought the need for preparedness and resilience to the forefront. And that's really where I'm going to focus my remarks for the next couple of minutes. And on top of that, my job is to provide some high-level coverage of climate planning and action at the state level, and to set the stage for Linda and Joyce, who are going to dive into some of the specifics. Next slide. Great. So go back one. There we go. Great. So the Maine Climate Council was established by the governor and the legislature to recommend a plan and strategies to meet the state's climate goals. On the energy efficiency and emissions reduction side, that's reducing emissions 45% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. In addition, there's a goal to build the resilience of Maine's communities, businesses, and natural resources. And the first plan to achieve that was completed in 2020. It was called Maine Won't Wait. The next plan, as statutorily required, is due in December of this year. That process is well underway. The Climate Council, in addition to its 39 members, has 6 working groups, 2 subcommittees, and 2 task forces, which together comprise about 225 people from across Maine, to deliver preliminary recommendations, which they did earlier this week, to the Climate Council for ways to meet those emissions reductions and resiliency targets. So those recommendations from the working groups and task forces cover transportation, our buildings, clean energy, natural and marine resources, community resilience, waste management, and land use. And these plans and recommendations provide guidance to the legislature, state agencies, and hundreds of public and private sector partners around the state around policy, programming, and investments. Next slide. So that last point, I'll highlight a couple of investments that have been made recently around the state, both at the state level and from federal funding sources. The first and really the most important here is $60 million for climate smart storm recovery in response to the storms of December and January. The governor and the legislature worked together to put this money together. It really covers three areas, one of which Joyce is going to talk about more in a moment. The first is $25 million for working waterfront infrastructure that would not be otherwise eligible for FEMA funding. So this includes piers, other waterfront, privately held waterfront infrastructure that supports the fishing industry. Really important to get these investments so the fishing industry can get back on its feet, have the infrastructure it needs to head out to sea, to bring its catch back, and rebuild part of our really important coastal heritage. The next $25 million is for the Maine Infrastructure Adaptation Fund, which Joyce will say more about. And then there's $10 million for small businesses across the state that were impacted by the storms in December and January, help them get back on their feet. The next investment is $5 million for community resilience. I'll say more about this on the next slide, but this is funding to help communities, towns, tribes across the state think about resiliency, understand their vulnerabilities, and do some smart planning. We've been fortunate to be on the receiving end of a large amount of federal funding over the past 3 years. This includes funding that goes back to the pandemic recovery, and then the bipartisan infrastructure law, and then most recently the Inflation Reduction Act. So these $200 million or more has been invested in all kinds of activities, from electric vehicle charging to heat pumps and other weatherization energy efficiency projects, and to some significant community resilience and natural resource resilience projects across the state. If you want to learn more about those investments, particularly the federal investments, we have a number of dashboards on our office's website, maine.gov/future, where you can see how those investments are being made across the state, both geographically. We've got some fantastic mapping tools there, and then also in the types of projects that those fundings are enabling. Next slide. Thank you. The Community Resilience Partnership is one of the priority areas of the first plan from 2020. This is a program established by my office to assist communities across the state in taking action that aligns with the state's goals and priorities around climate. We've had a really wonderful turnout from communities across the state. Almost half of the communities in the state are participating now, 226 communities, representing almost 70% of the state's population. We've been able to make grants to these communities to the tune of $8.5 million since 2022. We just announced a new batch of grants this past week, $2.5 million going out to 54 communities, just announced here on Monday. These projects cover energy efficiency, clean energy, and then climate adaptation and resilience. And that $5 million that I mentioned on the last slide for community projects comes through this program right here. So you can see on the map on the left that we've got pretty good coverage across the state. We've got some areas we really want to fill in some gaps with, and we're working with our partners to make that happen. Next slide. And then this is all to tee up Linda. In May, the governor signed an executive order establishing the Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission to really learn from the experience of the December and January storms, and learn how the state can do better, both in preparing for events like that and reducing our risk, helping communities prepare and reduce risk. And so I'll turn it over here to, I'll turn it back to Patrick to introduce Linda, but this is where Linda's going to pick up. So thanks very much. Pleasure to be with you all this afternoon.
Thank you, Brian. And I'll quickly turn to Linda, where Stonington hosted the governor, where she signed this executive order, and very appreciative of having Stonington's expertise, but also a community that obviously is at the forefront of a marine-based economy and one that is vulnerable to this changing climate. I'll turn to Linda. Linda, sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Brian, and to the rest of the panelists today. And it's an honor and a privilege to serve on the Governor's Commission, and it's my privilege to be here with all of you today. I'm in a little bit of a position of being the boots on the ground for business because I am the Economic and Community Development Director for the town of Stonington. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit before I get to the work of the commission about the business impacts that I see in the new recommendations to the Climate Council that came out this week. Next slide, please. You've all seen these scenes of devastation from the winter storms. What I wanted to talk to you about for just a moment with 2 slides was just about the impact on our economies and to think about our changing business environment. Because that, when we talk about adaptation, that is what we're really talking about. We're talking about resilience, which means to adapt, which means to change. So as businesses, as business owners, we're going to need to think about how do we change, how do we partner with the state and the federal government to change our businesses, to change our workforce in the face of the changes climate is bringing to us. So this is the Stonington Town Landing being overwashed by the first storm in January. That's our fire department on the left, which was totally flooded out. And the main center for coastal fisheries, there's a restaurant just to our left as well. Next slide, please. This road goes to Stonington's deepest port and harbor, which is home to the barge landing, where barges from all of the surrounding islands. Stonington is the center of the largest archipelago in the state of Maine, come to land, and including over 150 truckloads of granite, which is still quarried in Stonington, leave from this port every year. This port also houses another of our 42 of our 350 individually owned and operated fishing businesses. The fishing fleet in Stonington is the largest in the state for our size, and all of that material, all of those goods go over our roads, causeways, and bridges to markets. Next slide, please. As the previous speakers have said, and this can't be emphasized enough, what we realized in Stonington and what we've realized around the state is that we're moving too slowly to avoid damage to our economy, and that to adapt, to change, is going to cost us some money, and that insurance is a less visible business issue in all of this. If we go back to slide 3 there for a second, I want to go back to that road for a moment. The road, we had already done a sea level rise study in Stonington back in 2018. This road is our #1 priority. It took us until last year to get funding from the Northern Borders Regional Commission to raise this road. It takes another year to do the plans, another year to do the permitting, especially because we've now had to change plans based on what we saw here with the hydrology. And for any of these infrastructure construction projects, you're looking at 2 to 3 years in many cases in terms of the building process. So when I say that we are too slow, part of what I'm saying is that the size of the infrastructure that needs to be adapted does not change overnight. So if we're looking at 2 years, 3 years, 4 years into the future, what does that mean for the businesses on this road? What does that mean for Stonington on the other end of a causeway and its $55 to $70 million a year lobster industry, which makes up 11% of the state total? That's what I mean about the pace. Those are the realities of the timing that we're looking at. Go ahead and you can advance again. So these adaptations are too big for private business alone. Yes, as private businesses, we're going to have to partner with our local governments, our state governments, and the federal government to make a lot of these adaptations. We're going to be able to have to change our business strategies and most importantly, using Stonington again as an example, retrain our workforces. In Stonington, where lobster is now king, those species, as Brian mentioned, are changing. As the waters warm, the species change. The way you fish for different species requires different equipment, requires different skills. We need to be able to make those transitions. We need to be able to invest in our workforces to be able to make those natural resource transitions that the climate is demanding. Stonington only has 1,000 people in it. It is very rare for a town our size to have an economic and community development director at all. Sometimes they don't even have a town manager. They mostly have a board of select people, and those folks are scrambling right now because they can't make decisions fast enough or with enough information or with enough support to face this timeline. Next slide, please. That's where the Climate Council and the Governor's Commission come in. Without that kind of partnership, places like Stonington up and down the coast, these communities are actually at risk of disappearing as we know them. And we have to really ask ourselves, what does Maine's business economy look like when these changes happen? You know, does fishing just transform itself into tourism? Or does even tourism become affected by the ability to get places and by the ability to get insurance? So I think we're looking at a very vulnerable business time. And I think that the way the state has stepped up in terms of the Climate Council and all of the learning and the recommendations that have happened there, and the Governor's Commission on Infrastructure is vital to our ongoing ability to transform our economic system. So here's just a few of the key points that were released this week from the Climate Council that I think are key to business people. These are the things I think that will impact our businesses in the shortest amount of time and in the biggest way. The conservation of state lands has to happen more quickly. And that's for carbon storage, which is about mitigation, but also habitat protection and recreation. The biggest thing I heard this week was a new focus on our food supply. We don't really grow enough or create enough or produce enough of our own food in Maine. And as we're seeing, as the climate changes, there's going to be more and more need perhaps to do that. If transportation for any reason for a short time is cut off, where is our food system? Who benefits from it? Who has access to it? So conserving agricultural land is good not only as mitigation, but is good as adaptation. Increasing the percentage of Maine food eaten by Maine people, decreasing food waste, and transitioning workforces to different species and growing seasons. These affect Maine businesses across the spectrum. We are all reliant on our food supply. And tourism, especially, which has become more and more focused on food tourism, is an important part of this, a very important part of this. The other thing that the new recommendations talk about that are going to be important for business owners are new emphases on land use and materials management. Now, you hear materials management and you think, how are we using building materials? This is traditionally called waste management, and it's going to have to change. This might incur additional costs for municipalities, for the state, how we're handling the amount of waste, if you will, or materials, and how are we transferring that what was once waste to new uses. Again, a business problem and a business opportunity. Because I think for us as business people and economic development people, we have to see the opportunities in this. We have to see the opportunities in change and in adaptation and be looking into the future along with the Climate Council, along with the Governor's Commission, to say, how are we going to take advantage of these opportunities? How are we going to get in front of them? Can we get in front of them? I think that with good partnerships between the local, the state, the federal, and the business communities, I think we can get in front of them. Next slide, please. So the infrastructure investments are key, and this is where my handoff to Joyce comes in. And this is what the Governor's Commission on Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience is very much focused on. Roads, bridges, highways, and wharves are the lifeline of our Maine economies. We know our coastal communities are key not only to our food supply in terms of the seafood industry, but also to tourism. And In the Western Mountains and in Aroostook County, that's where some of the food is being grown. And again, the roads, bridges, highways, and wharves that were so badly hit during these storms are in fact the lifeline of all this. So Stonington, for example, moves annually over State Route 15, 11% of the state lobster catch. And that's just one small town. Next slide, please. So the Governor's Commission, our mission is to listen, to act, and to implement. It's to take the Climate Council recommendations and to come to your town, to come to your business, and to hear what your actual experience is so that we can tailor specific recommendations for action and implementation. That's where the speed comes in. And that's what the commission is very concerned about, is putting this kind of urgency around the timeline that we know exists. The listening session started in Stonington, which is a great microcosm of all of our coastal communities and our coastal industries. It then went down south to Old Orchard Beach, where our tourism industry on the waterfront was hit very badly. And next week, we'll be headed to the Western Mountains, where all of those industries were hard hit by river flooding and road destruction. One of the things that we have to look at in rebuilding and resilience is how do we do it in a way that we're not constantly rebuilding? And that's what our fishermen are asking. And in some ways, fishermen are excellent scientists. We can look at them as being on the front lines of some of these climate changes. They're the ones out on the water. They're the ones experiencing sea level rise. They're the ones experiencing species changes. And so they bring back an enormous amount of information. When our wharves were destroyed in that first January storm, we could see that it wasn't over. Everybody is hesitant to rebuild because they can't afford to rebuild 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. So we're looking to the state for recommendations. We're looking to bigger entities to say, how do we build better? How do we rebuild with resilience? Because with a working waterfront, you can't retreat. And that might be a strategy for some of our businesses. But with working waterfronts, they're there. They're on the waterfront because they have to be. So there is no retreat. There is only action, and we have to do it better. So when the Governor's Commission either comes to your town or near to you, or if you want to talk to us for any reason, that's why we're here. And we're on a very fast track. The first report is due in November. So we are gathering information. We're meeting every other week, and we're making as many site visits as possible. So we listen, we're acting, and we're implementing. Thanks for having me with you today.
Well, thank you, Linda. Thanks for your leadership, for Stonington, for stepping up as the co-chair and leadership on this fast-moving task force for investing in infrastructure. I did want to turn to our last speaker, Joyce Taylor, who has also been very busy. Thank you for your public service and your team as chief engineer of the Maine DOT. I know for a fact you have been extremely busy in the aftermath of the restoration and the long-term planning for our state's infrastructure. Joyce?
Thank you, Patrick. I will probably say a lot of what Linda did and have a sense of urgency. If we can go to the first slide, Maine DOT has certainly been, that's like in the middle of the pack, but yeah, there you go, has been very intimately involved in this subject for years now. And if you want to go to the next slide, I can talk about some of our climate goals. One thing I'd like to say is this is actually a road washout in Glen Burn. And really up before, some of you may remember Tropical Storm Irene for us, where we lost bridges in the Sugarloaf area and had some damage in Western Maine. A lot of the infrastructure that both the state and the towns are losing have been from what I would call not microbursts, but high intensity, high volume of water in a short amount of time, where you get 4 to 6, 7 inches of rain and 6 hours, and we lose these culverts. We haven't been losing bridges, we've been losing culverts. We've had detours as much as 60 miles, an 80-mile detour. These are significant economic issues. Many of these we cannot just go in overnight fun fact, even in an emergency, you have to get permits. So it's not something that you can just typically go in and do overnight. We have a great relationship with agencies. They work really hard with us, but it still takes some amount of time. If you want to go to the next slide. So one of the game changers here is we haven't had a big storm inland in a long time. And anyone who knows me in all the time that I've been working with the Climate Council as a co-chair of the Transportation Working Group, everyone wants to talk about sea level rise, and I greatly appreciate the issue. But I have been like a broken record that Western Maine is where we tend to lose road infrastructure. And that has been where our major damage has been at different times. I can tell you the bridge maintenance engineer called me at like before 7 a.m. December 19th and said, Joyce, it's Armageddon in Region 3, our Western region. He said, I can literally not get to bridges to even look at them. I don't know how to get there. And, people were shut off. They couldn't get power. They couldn't get out. So it was a really big issue, both economically, an EMS issue, just a safety issue. So we had a lot of damage, a lot of road damage. We did not lose any bridges. We did, if you look at the picture on the right, lose about 5 bridge approaches. But luckily, we did not lose bridges. You want to go to the next slide. And then I think you've heard people talk about the coastal storms. These are all communities with state roads. And I can tell you that some of these folks, we've been having conversations about raising roads or raising bridges. And we've had people saying, climate change isn't real. And one of the things that I typically will say, well, if you don't believe in climate change, that's fine. But do you believe climate's changing in Maine? And most people will say yes to that. And so that's, trying to get their awareness. But these are really complicated issues because if you go in and try to raise a causeway, for example, or a bridge in the middle of a village in Maine, you're going to have to take property, you're going to have to go up, especially in a village. You might end up taking 4 properties in that village, and people are not ready for that yet. And so I think, the conversations we're having need to go faster for us to do some action. If you want to go to the next slide. So some of the things that DOT has done, a number of years ago now, really even before the Mills administration, we did change some of our guidance, especially culvert guidance. We've been designing now for 100-year flow rates for quite a while. And I can tell you during these storm events, we have not lost any of our culverts with the new design standards. In a lot of ways, we were doing it for some other things because of fish passage. 2/3 of the state is critical habitat for endangered fish species. And so we're under a lot of pressure and an agreement to do fish passage, but it had a win-win benefit as far as we were concerned, because we know that when we increase culvert size, that we are not losing the roads where the culvert is. And we've been encouraging towns to follow our lead. We've also started to use the 4 foot of sea level rise in the next 100 years to at least have the conversation. We don't go up 4 feet in every case. As I said, sometimes the communities just aren't ready for that. Or, maybe the bridge is going to be high and dry, but is everything else leading to it going to be underwater? So we're trying to have system conversations and trying to make sense of what is the best investment for the state of Maine. If you want to go to the next slide. So there are several tools that we're working on. We're actually working on a high resolution dynamic model, a sea level rise model that we will share with municipalities that will be predictive. And part of what we're looking at is, how often does something get inundated? How deep is it? If it's 6 inches every twice a year, that's probably not a big deal. But if it's, every couple weeks and it's feet, that's a different conversation that we have to have around, again, if you're going to have a bridge that's 4 feet up, but nobody can access it because all the roads are underwater, where do you want to spend your money? We also at DOT are looking at our own infrastructure and trying to figure out in the inland case, what's vulnerable, what roads are vulnerable, where are the emergency access, where do the power companies need to access first to be able to get to the corridors, where do we need to put a little more time and attention in terms of making sure our roads are accessible. So you can go to the next slide. We are administering the Maine Infrastructure Adaptation Fund right now. This is our third round. I won't talk about it much, but go to the Maine DOT website. You can find it. It's open for communities. It closes July 1st. We have a stream crossing grant program. So Patrick alluded to the fact the legislature appropriated money. We have $25 million that we are determined to get out the door this year for communities to help them address resilience issues. Next slide. Here is the in 2024, we had about $2 million. And here's just a map of where some of those projects were awarded. So right now, the current round is our third round of funding. To date, we have used all of that money and we are getting it out. We're trying to pick projects that are ready for construction or they're well along in design, to Linda's point, to start getting things done. So that's one of our focuses. Next slide. So eligible projects: wastewater, drinking water, stormwater, raising roads, culverts, anything was flooded during these storm events that needs some resilience funds to help them be more resilient. We are looking to fund those kinds of things. And next slide. So next slide too. I just want to talk about, we kicked off a number of causeway projects a few years ago, thinking they would be simple resilience projects, anticipating discretionary grants coming from the federal government. And I will just say, to Linda's point, we are running into issues. This is Deer Isle. They have been cut off many times leading up to the bridge. This causeway gets underwater. We have to go in and literally plow the debris out of the road. We've cut it off during certain storm events and closed it. What we're finding, these projects are complicated. You have traffic impacts when you have a narrow causeway. How are you going to move the traffic during construction? We are finding that there are environmental groups. All of a sudden, there's no culvert openings, no bridges in these causeways, and all of a sudden, environmental folks see this as a once in a generational opportunity to do wetland restoration, or in this case, scallop restoration. And so people are asking us to do these studies that could go 5 years long. And we're like, no, we don't have time to study something for 5 years. We're discussing like how high it goes. People are questioning, is 4 feet enough? And then a lot of times these are narrow areas and people want bike and pedestrian facilities. And so all of a sudden, what seemed like a simplistic project just doubled in price. And then from a permitting point of view, I will just say we have got to figure out permitting at the federal level, because in my experience, some of the agencies do not understand how to treat sea level rise projects or resilience projects. For example, if we raise this causeway and we have wetland impacts, we're going to be asked to do over $1 million of mitigation payments for wetland. And it's not that I'm saying wetlands are less important than resilience, but asking us to, or anyone, to pay mitigation doesn't make sense. And it could stop a project from happening. And so I don't think it really, I don't think the federal rules have caught up to the rhetoric about working on resilience. If you want to go to the next slide, there's another one I'll show you. Scarborough Marsh is another one we've been working on. And in this case, there's this huge desire to have marsh restoration. Our goal was just to go in and raise the road 4 feet. And it's basically, we were asked to delay the project and study it. And we said, okay, we will give you a year. You have a year to study what you want. Tell us what opening size you want. If it's reasonable, we'll give it to you. But we don't want to wait 5 years. And frankly, the town has expressed, no, we've been underwater. We don't want to wait. So I would just conclude, because I know we're getting to the end of it, to Linda's point, there's a lot of competing needs that are beginning to come up with these resilience projects. And it doesn't really feel like anyone at the federal level is in charge of sort of collating all of those needs and understanding what trumps what. I think at the state level, we've done a pretty good job at state agencies. We talk at the commissioner level, people are talking, we're having conversations, but I think at the federal level, there's work to be done. And I'll just end there because I know we're done.
Well, thank you, Joyce. Those are powerful examples, I think, of an overarching theme that climate is pressuring our public policy on mitigation, on adaptation, on our permitting. for clean energy projects and also for adapting to a changing climate. We do have a few minutes for questions, and I'll turn to the people in our chat. But I did want to start just with a reflection on there was an assessment that land conservation needs to be part of our state plan, and I'm so encouraged to hear that our culvert success is having benefits now. On where is it? Where does nature-based solutions come in for the state of Maine? I know that's been a focus in some other states. Clearly, in the Gulf Coast, there's been a focus of that for mitigating impacts of hurricanes. Is that going to be a part of the infrastructure? I'll let anybody respond.
I will take a stab. I'll be like the not the negative person in the room, but I think storm surge and violent storms, nature base has its place, but not everywhere. And I think that we have to understand that. And when you're talking public safety infrastructure, or you're talking about livelihood, nature-based isn't for everywhere. And I think you really, if it's flooding and you're not getting the pounding of the waves or the action, the physics, at work, if you will, I think it's fine. And we are doing some of it at DOT. We've done it and we will do more. But there are times when old-fashioned hardening is what you have to do. And I know that's not a popular view right now, I can tell you, but I will say that all day long.
Well,
Thank you, Joyce.
I'll join you, Joyce, in that we have to do a mix of smart solutions. I couldn't emphasize enough how we need to be very practical at this point. And, Joyce said a very important thing just now, public safety. So when it comes to public safety, we have to be able to do what we need to do to make sure that the public is safe. That's our first job at the local and municipal level.
Thank you,
I'm
Linda. Ivan,
going to
you want
toot Joyce's horn for a
Ivan,
little
please.
bit.
Yeah.
If I could
Go
toot
ahead,
Joyce's
Brian.
horn, the culvert design that DOT has it serves a couple of purposes, and there's no reason that you can't have co-benefits with projects. And so these culverts that can pass really large flood volumes also allow fish to swim up and downstream too, and that's a really important design criteria on both ends of the public safety and the natural solution side. So I think it's possible to have both with really intelligent design, and I think DOT is doing a really good job of that with their culverts.
I just wanted to add, no argument with anything that Joyce or others have said. The category of nature-based solution, though, is pretty big, and so right now we're focusing on infrastructure specifically, but a lot of nature-based solution encompasses ecosystem health and integrity, and how we manage natural systems, and soil health and agriculture, and forests soaking up carbon. And so across that broad array, I think without question, nature-based solutions is a really critical part of Maine's overall climate response. In the category that we're talking about here relative to infrastructure, whatever they said, they're the pros.
One last question. If people do have anything in the chat, please raise your hand. I think the saying goes that sometimes you build an army to fight the last war, but is the last storm indicative of what we should prepare for? I do also, I was so pleased to see the insurance industry part of the commission looking at data on where are the impacts. And then maybe a separate sort of theme is just looking at a lot of our challenges are based on ecosystems, whether that's a river system, and Hollowell and Augusta are sort of interacting with the same challenges, and building a regional infrastructure with our river systems. But maybe, Ivan, are these last storms sort of indicative of what our challenges going forward and what we should be preparing for going forward?
I think undoubtedly yes, and with more uncertainty, and remember the trajectory is ongoing change, and oftentimes accelerating change. And so the storms that we experienced in Stonington and elsewhere this past winter, in and of themselves, the characteristics of them were not particularly remarkable, except that they're happening on a rising baseline. And so we're seeing that relative to temperature, relative to wind speed, relative to some of the blocking patterns we see in these weather systems. So I think yes, and I don't think the worst is yet to come. But we have a lot of control of where that goes. What we do now, between now and 2050, actually, particularly, has a huge impact on what Maine will be like between 2050 and 2100. So for those future generations.
Joyce, were you going to jump in?
No, I'm all set.
Well, thank you. Are there any questions in the chat? Richard, do we have any questions?
I don't see any currently, no.
Well, if are there any final comments? I'll turn to my co-host Rachel, but anything else from our panelists?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just thank you for hosting this, and
Thank
thank you to all
you.
the participants. Really happy to have this conversation today.
On one of the hottest weeks of the year, while at least a couple of us have thunderstorms overhead about to knock us out. Yes, very timely.
Well, thank you. You certainly highlight the scale of the work that's ongoing at the state, municipal, and at the university level. So I so appreciate you joining us today to give a snapshot to our membership of what's occurring and what to prepare for. And I'll turn to my co-host here, Rachel, with Science is Us.
Well, that sums it up. So I just echo our thanks to all of you for participating and also for providing some hope in there, right? There's things that we can do. There's a lot that we can do. And I think it was Ivan who also said, listen, we know more, right? The science is increasing. Our ability to use science and evidence in our policy decisions and all of our decisions is improving, and that should give us hope and optimism. There's work to be done, but it's work we can do. So thank you all for this great conversation, and thanks also to Patrick and the Chamber for allowing us to keep this conversation going.
Well, thank you. And stay tuned for the fall. We'll be discussing some carbon pricing mitigation strategies. As been alluded throughout, that is a huge component of the trajectory of a changing climate. Thank you all and appreciate all our panelists.